Ambassador Thixura of the Sorvith Diplomatic Corps had requested a coalition bodyguard for the KTH Science Station conference the way she requested most things, with specific criteria, precise expectations, and the absolute confidence of someone who had been doing this for 19 years and knew exactly what she needed. She had requested experience, professionalism, discretion, and this was the criterion she had emphasized most carefully: the ability to blend into a diplomatic environment without creating disruption. The Coalition Assignment Office had reviewed her criteria and assigned Sergeant Orin Vale. What the Assignment Office had not included in the transfer documentation, through an administrative oversight that the subsequent inquiry described as significant, was Sergeant Vale's complete service record, which would have contained on its third page the planetary origin classification, Earth, Class 4 Deathworld. Thixura had met Vale in the transit hub at 0800. A broad, quiet man with curly dark hair, and the kind of build that suggested his genetics had made very definite decisions about what he should look like. He had nodded at her briefing without interrupting, asked 2 precise questions about the station's layout, and followed her onto the transport with the presence of someone who took up space without demanding attention for it. She had found him adequate. The KTH Science Station was one of the Coalition's flagship research facilities, a domed complex on the outskirts of the Sorvith capital, where 17 research divisions conducted work across biology, astrophysics, material science, and the specific classification of research that the station's public documentation described as advanced xenobiology, and that most of the diplomatic community understood to mean things that were interesting to study and inadvisable to encounter outside containment. The conference Thixura was attending occupied the station's upper diplomatic floor. 12 hours of presentations, 3 bilateral meetings, and a formal dinner that she had been navigating the politics of for 6 weeks. It was exactly the kind of environment she had spent 19 years mastering. The incident happened at the 4th hour in the corridor between the xenobiology wing and the diplomatic reception area. The Croth specimen, a Vorai predator of the category that the Xenobiology Division's documentation classified as apex, armored, demonstrably hostile, had been in transit from one containment unit to another when the transport case's seal failed. The case had been rated for the specimen. The seal failure had been a manufacturing defect that 3 separate quality assurance checks had missed, which would be documented extensively in the post-incident review. What mattered in the immediate moment was that a Vorai predator, roughly 2 meters long, with armored chitinous plating and the specific temperament of something that had been in a box for 6 hours, was now in the corridor between the Xenobiology wing and approximately 40 diplomatic personnel. The station security team responded with professional speed. 2 officers were at the corridor entrance within 18 seconds, energy rifles raised, calculating an approach that would not result in the specimen charging through the reception area where 12 dignitaries were currently standing. The calculation was taking longer than the situation permitted. Orin was between Thixura and the specimen when it turned. The Vorai's behavioral pattern, which the Xenobiology Division had documented across 37 observation sessions, followed a specific threat assessment sequence: detect, orient, evaluate. Most species that encountered a Vorai in threat assessment mode experienced the evaluate phase as lasting approximately 3 seconds before the act phase concluded the discussion. The evaluate phase, when the Vorai oriented toward Orin, lasted considerably longer. The Xenobiology research lead watching from the corridor entrance would later note in her incident report that she had never observed a Vorai specimen spend 14 seconds in the evaluate phase. The species did not do that. Their evaluate phase was cursory. Orin looked at the Vorai with a specific quality of attention that 14 years of service on missions that the Coalition filed under extreme environment high-threat contact had produced. He did not move backward. He did not move forward. He stood in the corridor with the stillness of something that was also, in its own right, assessing. The Vorai made a sound. Low. Resonant. The specific vocalization that the observation reports classified as threat acknowledgement rather than threat initiation. The distinction mattered. It meant the specimen had encountered something it was categorizing as a peer threat rather than prey. Then it charged anyway because Vorai were not renowned for diplomatic resolution, and Orin met it with the efficiency of someone who had spent years on a planet where everything was trying to kill him and had developed opinions about how to manage that. The engagement lasted 40 seconds. At the end of 40 seconds, the Vorai was subdued, and Orin was kneeling on the floor with one fist still raised and a collection of new bruises that the medical team would document as impressive but non-critical. The shattered fragments of the transport case were distributed across approximately 6 meters of corridor. The station security team had not fired a single shot, primarily because there had been no window in which doing so would have been safe, and also because the situation had resolved before they identified one. Thixura stood in the corridor and looked at the scene. 19 years of diplomatic experience. She had navigated faction wars, succession crises, 3 separate coup attempts, and a trade conference that had technically started a minor armed conflict before she personally intervened. She had seen a great many things. She had not seen this. The security chief arrived at a run, assessed the corridor, and looked at Orin. "Origin?" he said, not as a question. "Earth," Orin said, standing up. The security chief closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them and began directing his team toward the subdued specimen. Thixura walked to where Orin was standing and looked at him in the specific way of someone recalibrating an assessment they had considered settled. "You didn't mention," she said carefully, "that you were from a death world." "You didn't ask," Orin said. He checked his shoulder. The armor had a new scoring mark where the Vorai's secondary claw had found a gap and appeared to find the assessment satisfactory. The briefing criteria were experience, professionalism, and discretion. I addressed all 3. A long pause. The Vorai paused, Thixura said. For 14 seconds. "They don't do that." "Things from Earth don't read as prey," Orin said simply. "We've had a long time to work on that." Another pause, filled by the sound of security teams managing the corridor and, somewhere distantly, 12 dignitaries being shepherded back to the reception area by station staff who were explaining that the situation was under control and that the dinner would proceed on schedule. Thixura looked at the corridor, at the specimen, at her bodyguard who had just done something that the Xenobiology division would be writing papers about for years. "The dinner," she said, "starts in 40 minutes. I need you presentable." Orin looked at his torn sleeve, looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was, she would later decide, amusement operating at a very low frequency. "I'll need 10 minutes, he said. He was ready in 8. The dinner proceeded without incident. The conference concluded successfully 2 days later. Ambassador Thixura submitted a formal commendation for Sergeant Orin Vale's conduct under pressure. Attached to the commendation was a separate recommendation addressed to the Coalition Assignment Office. It contained only 7 words. "Please include the Deathworld classification next time."